All right. And Sandra is going to make a change too, because you don't want to get Sandra mad. The next person, I don't know if I can really find the words to introduce. This small but very big woman that's had an influence in my life. See, you gotta really have something to convince me to get on one plane after another and fly for hours to different parts of the world to talk about what's happening here in this country. A woman who's had such an influence on my life that my youngest son, Guillermo, remembers her name. And when a child has so many different people sleeping in his house every night, and he doesn't remember their names, yet he remembers this woman, a woman that we love very much, that has touched all of us, that has taught us the importance of beginning to view things differently in the world and how we do our work on a daily basis and how we view each other. I'd like to call to the stage my friend, Corinne Kumar from the World Court of Women. Man, there's going to be so much crying here, Corinne. I'm telling you. So, Corinne is probably, when we're going to look back in history, she's going to be responsible for, some earth shifts, and I'm hoping that can be here in this country. And so I'm asking you to take this time to kind of take in every word that she shares with you right now, because we're going to need it in our struggle as we go forward. Corinne Kumar.
Sherry wants to make me cry before I start to speak, but she knows how precious she and Guillermo are in my life, and I feel so privileged to be here with all of you and to share these 3 days with you and get to know you a little more. I want to thank in a very special way before I start Adan, because I think of another church that I went to in Ghana in Africa, and there was this slave house. The slave house from where all the slaves in Africa were sent, this transatlantic slave trade. There's this little door, and they were simply pushed out into the sea on those little boats that sometimes they didn't make it into the boat, and sometimes they never made it across the Atlantic. But the reason I tell you this, Adan, is because there was a church next to the slave house. And when I went to that church, I cried because I thought, what was that church doing next to a slave house? And then I come here and I meet you, and Sherry tells me so much about you, and I see how you've opened this church, and I think that yes, of course, there are churches and different kinds of people. So I just want to thank you very much for being one of the miracles that Sherry spoke about at the church. I'm choosing to start this little reflection with you from something that the storytellers of Soweto started their congregation of storytellers. Soweto, is in South Africa. We have entered the night to tell our story, to listen to those who have not spoken, We who have seen our children die in the morning deserve to be listened to. We have looked on blankly as they have opened their wounds. Nothing really matters except the grief of the children. Their tears must be revered. Their inner silence speak louder than the spoken word, and all being and all of life shouts out in outrage. We must not be rushed to our truths. Whatever we have failed to say is stored secretly in our minds, and all those processions of embittered crowds have seen us lead them 1,000 times. We can hear the story over and over and over again, because our minds are muted beyond sadness. There is nothing more that we can fear. We live, friends, in fearful times. Members of the jury, we saw your dancing feet, and we wait to hear your dancing minds. Women and men who will offer their testimonies, women and men who are the core of this court, we will listen to the testimonies at the US World Court on Poverty and Homelessness. Sherry and her wonderful band of volunteers and people who work with her at the Poor and Homeless People's Economic and Human Rights Campaign. To the many all over the world who have sent messages to us, who walk with us in solidarity. To the many dreamers in the room, Iman and Sandra and all the young people here. We indeed live, friends, in very fearful times. We live these times that are not only fearful, but that are also violent. Times in which collective and community memories are dying. Times in which our never-ending dreams, or our many dreams, are turning into never-ending illusions, into nightmares, but illusions of power, of wealth, of freedom, while the future increasingly is fragmenting. Times that are collapsing the many life visions into a single cosmology that has created its own universal truths of equality, development, peace, freedom, truths that are inherently discriminatory, even violent. Times that have created a globalized world order that dispossesses the majority, that desacralizes nature, that destroys and has destroyed whole cultures and civilizations, denigrating the people on the margins, the women, the poor, the homeless. Times in which the war on terrorism, talk of the war on terrorism in the world, a la Pax Americana, brings a time of violent uncertainty and of brutal wars. Wars are wars for resources, for oil, for land, for diamonds, for minerals, the wars of occupation. Times that are giving us new words, and these words have simply crept into the media and crept into our vocabulary. Words like the preemptive strike, think what that means, collateral damage, children dying, embedded journalism, enemy combatants, unmanned drones, military tribunals, rendition. This is a whole new vocabulary, new words, friends, but these words are soaked in blood. The war on terrorism has also given us in this country times in which the name of the war on drugs, in the name of the war on drugs, thousands of poor, black, male, and increasingly female are incarcerated in America's jails. This kind of mass incarceration of a particular and a specific community is legalized racism. Times of the, and I'm quoting now from Michelle Alexander, she talks of the title of her book, The New Jim Crow. Times of the New Jim Crow, as she writes, is a new racial caste system that hides the depths of black suffering, if I can just say this. And she continues where she says, America is a country of racial symbols, many racial symbols, and of great achievements, yet it refuses the substance of its shame. I think that is a very powerful quote from her. Times in which black and poor communities are increasingly dispossessed, but also devalued and destroyed, because the categories of progress and poverty are unable to grasp the brutality of the times. The economically abandoned, the socially abandoned, are not just poor, but there is a kind of destitution, a misère, a destitution today. They are increasingly destitute. The disappeared and the disappearing, to whom we dedicate this quote. I ask you, friends, to go to that place inside all of us where stillness and movement come together, and to listen to the many voices who will speak today, who will sing today, who will tell stories today, but listen to the many voices unspoken, to the many outside unspoken who are not here with us. Times in which then the dominant political thinking, the institutions, the instruments of justice are hardly able to redress the violence that is escalating and intensifying. Times in which progress presupposes the genocide of the many and the genocide of the women. The violence taking newer, more contemporary forms. Times in which human rights have come to mean the rights of the powerful and the rights of the privileged. And for the masses to have their human rights, they must surrender the most fundamental human right of all, and that is the right, the very right to be human. Times in which the political spaces for the other is closing, is not only diminishing, but I think it's even closing. The world, it would seem, is at the end of its imagination. And who will deny, not any of you in this room, who will deny that we need today another imagination, another political imaginary? Because perhaps it is in this moment when systems of meaning begin to break down. It is precisely in this moment that we can search for new meanings. We need, therefore, another political imaginary. It is not difficult for us to see, friends, that we are at the end of an epoch when every category and every construct begins to have a hollow sound, and we seem to be groping in the dark for the new. Can we find new words? Can we search for new ways? I'm looking at the jury now. Can you help us to do this? Can we create out of the material of the human spirit possibilities to transform the existing social order, to discern, therefore, a greater human potential? We need to imagine alternative perspectives for change, to craft these visions that will evolve out of different kinds of conversations, conversations across cultures, conversations across traditions, conversations between cultures that transcend, and that's the important point I want to make, that transcend the totalitarianism of the dominant logos. The dominant logos is the Western logos. So conversations then, therefore, that are not mediated by the hegemony of the universal discourse. And if I would just choose human rights, because all of us are working in some way or the other in the area of human rights, it would mean that this new imaginary would begin to offer us, would begin to invite us to another human rights discourse, one that will not be trapped either in the universalisms of the dominant thinking, linked as it is to a market economy, to a monoculturalism, to a materialist and a consumerist ethic, to the politics and the polity of the nation state. Neither must it be caught, and that's not this either or, modernity or tradition, universality or cultural specificity. Neither must it be caught in the discourse of the culture specific, but one that will offer a set of universals that have been born out of a dialogue of civilizations. And this will mean, friends, another ethic of dialogue. In some way, not the kind of dialogue that pushes, that takes positions, but another ethic of dialogue. We need to find a new perspective on the universality of human rights in dialogue with other cultural perspectives of reality, other notions of development, for instance. Development as we know it today in the model that is the dominant model is the dominant of Homo economicus. It is economic man. But the word development simply talks to the economic dimension, to the economists in the room. The economic dimension, the per capita, measured by per capita, measured by gross national product, by patterns of industrialization, now the information and communication technologies, it's always been the economic dimension. In the Arab world, and in Arabic, you have another word for development. There's no word for development, but umran would be the closest. And umran means the development of the material and the spiritual. So therefore, do we need to look again at development models? Do we need to look again at democracy? And I just go into democracy a little bit because this is the magical export of the US and the West, and we need to look at it again. But even dissent, we need to look at even dissent, not only democracy, but even dissent, and therefore other notions of power. I think power is very important, how we see power within our own groups, within our movements, within alternative movements. But power, the dominant notions of power, is the power to hegemonize, the power to use, and therefore the power to misuse, and the power to abuse. So these concepts of power, are they concepts of power and governance that can encourage, that can enhance? This means another ethic. Other notions of equality, for instance. Equality makes us faceless citizens in a nation state. Do we need to look at another concept of dignity that comes from roots, that come from depth? The poor and homeless people speak of a dignity. How would we connect this? Because humankind proffers many horizons of discourse. And just because our eyes don't see those horizons, it doesn't mean that these horizons don't exist. So to the dreamers in the room, these different horizons, what are they talking about? Just a word on democracy, because I think we all use, coming from India, we say we are the largest democracy, you are the greatest democracy, and so let's talk about democracy. We take this concept of democracy. In the dominant understanding of democracy is tied to a notion of rights, but is tied to a notion of individual rights. There is almost no space for community or for collective. Notion of private property. Private property is the cornerstone of the whole liberal discourse and the whole Enlightenment movement. And so private property is very important. The market economy. This is what we are tied, the democracy is tied to the market. Now anybody who has studied a little economics will know that the market is the guarantor of inequality. Some must have, I'm looking at all my labor organization friends, and some must have, and the many will not have. The majority must fall out of those holes, must fall out of the safety nets of the IMF and the World Bank, simply fall out and become poor and destitute and with nothing. $1 a day, $2 a day of the World Bank. This tells us nothing. So how have we not seen, how shall we understand this rhetoric of political equality, where each of us are equal because we have the one vote, but we are in the context of a market economy where all of us must be unequal. Otherwise the market doesn't work. It's so fundamental in many ways. Therefore we must seek new understandings of democracy that will include a concept of freedom that is different from what is enshrined in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment and its market, of course. There is an urgent need to reinvent the political. Jill and Sherry, we are looking at you now. To reinvent the political, to infuse the political with the ethical. The new political imaginary speaks very strongly to an ethic of care. Somebody has to stop me. I realize nobody will, and I am one of those creatures that take maximum advantage when nobody stops me. Does that mean stop? No. So I give you permission. Anyone, starting with Sherry, anyone on the jury, anyone in the room, just stand up, and then I know I have to stop. Okay? Okay? Because I want to say something about the courts, and then that the courts, in a way, are a small, a minuscule contribution to this articulation of this new imaginary. So I just want to link it with what I'm saying on this, okay? In its vision and methodology, the courts of women challenge the dominant ways to knowledge. I spoke a little of this with the jury today. But in the dominant ways to knowledge, it is the rational, the scientific, the logical, the distanced, the vivisected, far away. The further you are away from your object of study, the better you will study it. So this way to knowledge is only the rational way. And the rational way, the scientific way, is also the patriarchal way. It's the male way of being distanced from. Now the courts of women are saying something else. The courts of women are saying, but there are different ways to knowledge. There are different ways of knowings. If we listen to different tellings, there is the knowledge that is written on our skins. That is a knowledge. a knowledge written on our skins, but who gives any value to that knowledge? There is the knowledge of intuition, the knowledge of storytelling, the knowledge of metaphor, the knowledge of poetry, many knowledges that will not fit into this paradigm of the rational knowledge. And therefore what the courts are saying is that we need another way to know. We need to combine both. We need reason and we need compassion. We need our heads and our hearts. We need the logic, but we also need the lyric. We need the personal subjective testimony, but we need the objective analytical context. We need the pain and the poetry and the politics. This is what the courts are about in many ways. So it is how we will weave this together that will then take us to deeper layers of knowledge. And from those deeper layers of knowledge, we will see it differently. The courts then are like public hearings, but the court is used in a symbolic way, as probably Sherry has told you often. The voices of the survivors, the voices of women and men are listened to. They bring their personal testimonies of violence and therefore transform, I would say, private individual pain it gives it its public face and therefore its political significance. The courts are, Sherry said that this morning, the sacred spaces where women and men speaking or singing or storytelling in a language of suffering name the crimes, seeking redress, even reparations and a healing. The court's friends consciously adopt vulnerability. This is a very important part of the courts in its imagination. I need some water, Sherry, please. And the women and men bringing their testimony is also, in many ways, are talking about their experiences. Also, I really need water. Bear witness to the experiences, to their experiences. Also, talk in terms of the fragility of life as it encounters the brutality of violence and power. The courts offer these spaces for all that is vulnerable and fragile. And from here is the beginning of drawing the contours of another imaginary. From here, from these sites of pain, from these sites of trauma, can we begin, and that's my question, can we begin to reimagine justice? First, do we think that justice needs to be reimagined? And if so, can we begin to reimagine justice from these sites of pain? From the court today, where does it take us? Does the kind of institutions and instruments of justice, are they sufficient for our times? Or do we need something that is very different? Do we need to even to receive the tellings? Do we need to find other knowings? In its search then, therefore, towards this new political imaginary, the courts of women work towards a politics with an ethic of care. I know Rose writes much on this and she likes to speak more on this. We would like her to speak more on that. Because any theory of poverty lines, the World Bank, the $1 a day, that is disconnected from a theory of care and suffering will not listen to the voice of the other and simply leave the poor out. And this is what is happening in all political parties and political movements today. It is disconnected from an ethic of care. We have the ideology, we have the policies, we have the programs, but the care, the poor gets left out. The new political imaginary then speaks to an ethic of care, affirming in many ways one's responsibility to the other. An ethic that will include, and Sherry says this often, that will include compassion, that will include community, that will include connectedness, that will include this wonderful word of Ivan Illich, of conviviality, that will bring that conviviality, because the discourse and the rights and the praxis of rights cannot only mean economic and political emancipation, but must challenge at a very deep level the paradigms of thought, of knowledge, and of politics, of course. So in many ways, we begin to move away from the straight line and start to walk in the forest with new knowledges and a politics that will bring a new ethic of care, with subjective, weaving the subjective with the objective. The courts of women, in their new imaginary, thank you very much, speak truth to power. In this, I think all of us know how to do. Speaking this kind of truth to power, challenging power, recognizing that concepts and categories enshrined in the ideas in the institutions of our time are unable to understand this. Women, yet the courts of women are more than speaking truth to power. They are more than being a critic of power. They are also offering to create this alternative point of authority. No? The courts speak truth to power, but the courts also speak truth to the powerless. And this is where the whole movement dimension comes in. And so I hope that we hear some voices today from the movements that are going to talk in terms of the resistance, the voices of resistance. So this is also the other part of it. It's not only speaking truth to power, but more importantly, speaking truth to the powerless and finding ways in which we can connect with this. It speaks to another notion of justice. I just want to say this and maybe end very quickly. It speaks a jurisprudence which while bringing individual justice also speaks of collective justice and reparations which will transform us all. So even though we call it the courts of women, the courts of women has a vision that is transformatory for women and men. A jurisprudence that is able to contextualize and to historicize the crimes, moving away from a justice that is enshrined in dominant thinking, a justice of revenge, a justice with punishment. Think of what happens. You are arrested, tortured, punished, put on death row, and the death penalty. That is it. The trajectory of justice is a justice of revenge, a justice of punishment. The courts of women are saying, can we find another concept of justice? Can we find other notions of justice? Can we find other ways to justice? Can we find ways to justice that are more restorative, that will restore dignity? Can we find ways to justice with truth, with reconciliation, with a justice with healing of individuals and of collectives? And so much of work needs to be done there in healing. And this the Comfort Women of Asia taught me. Do you know the story of the Comfort Women of Asia? In the Second World War, none of you in the room were born. I don't, maybe I can tell it later because maybe I'm taking too much of time. But to tell you this of how the need for justice, but we just leave it there. So is there a need for healing, not only of individuals, but of whole communities? And therefore, women and men writing another history, writing a counter-hegemonic history, writing a history from the margins. The courts, Sherry, begin that history from the margins. It is another voice. It is legitimizing in many ways memory, and therefore finding my voice in political discourse, and giving us that kind of voice in political discourse. Therefore, the courts, in refusing to separate the affective from the rational, the intuitive from the rational, if you like, creates a space in which emotive demands and which the trauma of people can have a place, can be understood. And this is so important for us, I think, in the courts. Because perhaps it is these expressions of resistance that seeks legitimacy, not by the dominant standards. And that's why the jury is so different. Not by the dominant standards, not from a dominant paradigm of jurisprudence, not by the rule of law even, that begin to draw the contours of this new imaginary. So the truth commissions like we had in South Africa, the public hearings, the people's tribunals, the US court, the US and the World Court on homelessness, begin to offer us our expressions of a new imaginary. I think we're already in that terrain of a new imaginary, refusing that human rights be defined and confined to the dominant hegemonic paradigm. The dominant discourse is entirely abstracted. That's the other point I want to make quickly. It's entirely abstracted from the language of responsibility. Do we need to bring that back? A discourse which is where the notion of rights is linked, had to be this, I feel, because it absolved the West from people that it enslaved, people that it exterminated. So they only had to be rights. Doesn't it strike us? There's no responsibility. Where are the responsibilities? Was it and this is what is meant by historicizing even the discourse. What are the roots, the historical, the ideological, the philosophical roots of the rights discourse? I think this is somewhere where we should come. The courts of women then, in a sentence if I say it, the courts of women and the courts of women and men are about subjugated peoples, are about marginalized peoples, are about silenced peoples, reclaiming their political voice and in breaking the silence, refusing those conditions by which power maintains its racist and patriarchal control. We need therefore to imagine justice differently, friends. The world courts interrupt, they speak to a disruption, to a trespass. The courts are finding new paradigms of knowledge and new paradigms of politics. A politics with care, concern, community, connectedness. A politics with ethics, a political vision that can transform us all. We all need a different dream. Martin Luther King told us of the dream he had many years ago. We need another dream. We need that violence in all its myriad forms be made unthinkable. That's a world to leave to our children's children, I think. The courts ask us to reimagine justice, other ways to justice, subverting patriarchal and racist discourse and praxis, weaving subjective text with objective context, moving us to deeper layers of knowings and tellings, refusing to separate the dancer from the dance, the reason and the compassion. We are the dancers, friends, but we are also the dance. I thank you so much for listening. I talked too much, but nobody stood up. Thank you.